Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Saving the World podcast with Luke Macmichael and Martin Rezny. And today we have another special guest, Zev Paiss, with us today from Protopian Futures. We're going to talk a little bit about his new book, from From Here to There series, Catapult. So without further ado, we'll just jump right in. Zev, do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit and tell us a little bit about your book?
Oh, well, gladly. Thank you so much, Luke and Martin. I appreciate being here, the opportunity to talk about it, and the opportunity to talk about the whole concept of protopia, which is a real up and coming concept. My background, I've been a sustainability educator and consultant for the past 40 years, involved in a whole wide variety of different sustainable endeavors, marketing, public relations around it, education, consulting with organizations, individuals, small governments, things like that. Basically, my whole background is in trying to help show people that there is a path forward that is much more sustainable, but doesn't leave us, living in a cave in the dark. It's really very optimistic, and it's not that different from what we are doing now, but it's a different way of approaching it and a different way of blending everything together.
Absolutely. I think the best way to share this kinds of ideas of protopia we found is always through stories. It's always through kind of inspiring people to envision a better world, whether it's your own version of utopia, or any kind of better world. That's what the protopian concept is always focused on. So tell us a bit about your book, Catapult, and the series From Here to There, and what you're trying to accomplish, and so on.
Gladly. I will mention that one of the inspirations for me was a book that came out in the mid 70s called Ecotopia, written by Ernest Kallenbach. And I read that, and immediately I already had an interest in urban planning and sustainable community. But I read that book, and it was such an aha for me about being able to present a story, whatever the story is, but the background of the story is set in essentially a protopian environment. And Ecotopia, it's written in the mid 70s, but it's about 1999 when Northern California, Oregon, and Washington secede from the United States and create their own stable state country called Ecotopia. And the protagonist goes there as a reporter and just writes about what he sees, and trying to educate people about how they're doing things differently. And that really gave me an idea that how powerful a story could be when put out there for people to look at and to immerse themselves in. So it was really quite an aha. And from that, I decided I wanted to put a vision out there to help people really see what we're talking about, and see that not only is it better, but probably more importantly, it's not that different. So my story, which the book is now the final version of, started off as a screenplay. And I wrote it and rewrote it a number of times, and then tried to get it out to Hollywood, and I don't really have the connections to do that at this point. So in 2011, I converted it into a novel, which required adding a whole lot more to it, and then self-published it and put it out. And then a year or two later, I actually put it out. I updated it a little bit and relaunched it, and then didn't really do much for quite a while. I've been involved in a lot of sustainable endeavors personally, but didn't really go back to writing until about a year or so ago, where I realized, okay, it's time to really get it out there in a big way. And so I really rebranded the story. I added quite a bit to it. I've got additional levels of editing, so I'm really proud of it right now. And the first, it's a series, as you mentioned. It's the From Here to There series, um, and this is book one. And I think that what's unique about it, one of the things that's unique about it, is that it's set in two timelines. It's set in 2025 and another timeline in 2065. And the story goes along. It's a mystery, and it goes along and explain. And you see the characters go through a whole variety of things And then eventually you begin to understand how the characters in this 40-year difference are connected. And I'm not going to say anything more about it than that, but I believe uh, it's a well crafted, kind of complex story that hopefully will keep readers, up at night reading, turning pages. This next in the series, and it's going to be probably 3 or 4 more books, actually covers the time between 2025 and 2065. So it truly is the from here to there story. How did we adapt to climate change, deal with the issues around uh, climate change and renewable energy, and kind of the social inequities that we're dealing with now. And you really get to kind of follow the protagonist, who's a female named Danielle Woodson. She's featured on the cover. Um, she's a bike rider. She doesn't own a car, and she is kind of weaving her way through traffic and ends up having to jump on the top of a car that cut in front of her. So that's kind of the cover that you'll see there, where it looks like an X bike expert, jumping over automobiles. So hopefully that will attract people's attention to at least take it off the shelf and take a look at it.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much. And of course, I've read the book. That's how we met originally, through Zev's Protopian Futures website, which of course our big focus now is trying to connect all these protopianists together in some ways. And I very much enjoyed it. I won't spoil any of the ending or anything. I guess we can't talk too much about it without spoiling a little bit, I guess. So, but just to let you know that there's a lot of interesting concepts there as far as futurism and what kind of technologies we might have, and then of course the problems in the near future that we're going to have to solve through various technologies. So I very much enjoyed, even though some of it might have seemed a little bit almost too far-fetched, I really enjoyed the concepts of just imagining what might be. And it kind of helps put me in the perspective of.
But I think that's I sort of full disclosure. I didn't really have enough time to read the whole thing. I did look at it and read it a little bit, sort of skimmed it, so that I had at least some feeling and idea for what it was trying to do. And I have to say, like, these problems, like it sounding a bit too far-fetched, like that's just the problems of all science fiction of all time, always. Like, it's basically impossible to predict the specifics. I think even the things that the shows or books or movies that people ascribe predictive powers to are a couple of different things going on. Like with Simpsons, for instance, like everybody is aware that Simpsons seem to have predicted a whole bunch of stuff happening. And it's like one mechanism is like the number of predictions you make. So if you're like Simpsons have 5 million seasons and you invent 15 million scenarios, that some of the wacky scenarios are going to happen, even if individually they feel completely implausible. And the other mechanism is more like Star Trek, where a couple of things have been invented that have been first shown in Star Trek as things that exist. And that's a concept of self-fulfilling prophecy, where you put the idea out there. Like the most famous example is the Ericsson flip phone. So basically mobile phone, that the inventor of mobile phone, the first one, was inspired by Star Trek to do it, because he wanted to replicate that's the whole reason there were flip phones, because in the original series of Star Trek, they had the communicator that was a flip phone, essentially. So there's like a couple of mechanisms that, like, if you think about it, like sometimes people do get it right, but I think that usually that has statistical or some other actual logical reasons. But most of the time, the predictions, like, it's very funny to look at predictions of future if you go back like the 19th century. And you have these like people with like what was like one of the images was like one thing they for sure thought is going to be really big were dirigibles. And it's so sort of like always ironic, because Hindenburg and stuff and dirigibles like completely like are dead, even though the technology exists. So it is really hard like to get the specifics right. So I feel it's more important like what the spirit of it is, of the message or of
I will mention, though, that my strategy was to take existing technologies, existing solutions that I have been involved with for 40 years, and take them and scale them up and integrate them. So, like, one of the scenes that I have is in a converted high school, which was converted into a wastewater treatment facility. but not a traditional one, but a biological one. And my senior thesis was on aquaculture for wastewater treatment. So I know exactly what it works. I know how it can scale up. I know what it does. And there's a meeting between two characters there that just happens to happen there. So what I'm doing is I'm not inventing, except for one relatively small aspect of the book. I'm not inventing anything. These are all existing working technologies. What hasn't been done is to get them at city scale and to integrate them so that the water that flows through the wastewater treatment plant is also spinning turbines to create electricity, and that the water is also used for agriculture locally and things like that. So it all makes sense. It's all possible, and a lot of it is already happening just at different scales. So these are not really predictions. It's more an extension of what we've already got going on if we think of it in that kind of a scale.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. It's just if you do this approach, it still has this sort of danger of the dirigible problem, where we've like 15 days from now, a new technology appears that makes something that's real and could be scaled up, makes obsolete. So
Sure.
that's just a thing that could happen. But yeah, I do like the whole concept of not trying to make up a fantasy, something that's unrealistic with there being no obvious ways to connect it from the present to the future, but showing possibilities. That's how I choose to see it. So just one question I would have from because I'm also a writer type person, and this kind of books also because like me and Luke. We are trying to, or we're considering trying to write something like this maybe in the future also to promote some protopian ideas that we have. So there's some sort of issues that we're sort of squaring with, and I think most authors of this genre have since the Utopia, the original work, and since the Enlightenment period. And that's like, if you're trying to do this kind of work, there's always this danger of making it too didactic, meaning that like there's this message and there's the story, and like this sort of it's about finding the balance between the message and the story. Like how do you find your experience of squaring off with
Well,
this problem of this genre?
in the earlier drafts, especially when it was a screenplay, it started off as a tour, more like Ecotopia. It started off as a tour of this future community, and people gave feedback and they said, "Well, this is just incredibly boring." So I said, "Okay, I need a story that is compelling, that's interesting, that really could happen in almost any setting." um, for the most part. So then I overlaid this background. So it's really like education just through immersion. There's almost no teaching that goes on. It's simply just someone having to explain something about it. Like there's several times where there's a class, a school of kids that have arrived like at the wastewater treatment plant, and there's someone who's kind of explaining how the process works in just a couple pages. So it's very simple, and it's done in that instance. It's done for kids. So
It's exposition. Like you can completely avoid exposition in a science fiction story.
yeah, yeah. So there's little pieces of that, but for the most part, it's just a passive background that you can see that, like, if you have things integrated, let's say you've got work and education and recreation and agriculture really close together, then all you need to do is to go for a short walk, and you are exposed to all of those things, and you just get to see how it works together. And then we talk about converting a big box parking lot into an urban garden. Obviously, a very straightforward thing to do politically, not so much, but the whole idea is that this is all very possible. And when you see it, you go, oh, that makes sense. And I'd be nice to be able to walk 3 blocks to what used to be a giant parking lot, and now it's a community garden.
The other question I had, another big challenge with I think with utopian ideas and novels in particular, is trying to find a good antagonist, because you can always have protagonists and lots of good things going on, but to have any kind of story, you've got to have some kind of evil villain or some kind of evil concept. And in Utopia, those things kind of don't exist. That's the whole concept of, or even in Protopia, those things are less likely to exist, or it's a safer, better world. So it's hard to kind of, bring a villain or negative thing into the story without kind of destroying the whole Protopian vision in some ways. So what's your opinion on how that can be done, I guess, well, without kind of destroying the concept of a better future?
Well, I mean, to use the example in Catapult, in the 2020 scenario, one of the big problems is traffic. And I grew up in Los Angeles, so I kind of came from that world. So part of the struggle in 2020 is dealing with this overarching uh, challenge of gridlock, essentially, of parking, of highways becoming parking lots. So my antagonist is someone who is negatively affected by that and blames the protagonist, or at least what she represents, for his personal problems.
Hmm.
So it kind of just evolved into something that made sense. Now in the 2060, the antagonist isn't actually a person; it's the condition. It's climate change, or actually more specifically, it's water.
Hmm.
And we know that water is, especially here where we are in Colorado, and in the Southwest, water is a huge issue. In other places, water is a huge issue right now because of flooding, unprecedented flooding. So, so, so I was able to use kind of an environmental condition as the antagonist in 2065, where there's actually a person who suffers, horrible experience related to a man-made condition around traffic.
That makes sense. I think the concept is even in Protopia, there's always going to be problems,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
there's always going to be some kind of major problem that you can turn into some kind of fun story if you come up with solutions to that problem, and have your arc, your climax, and all these other kind of typical thematic elements in a Protopian environment.
Well, and
It's like in Star Trek.
the whole concept of protopia, where things are slowly but surely getting better, doesn't preclude the fact that some things aren't good right now at all. So it's something to continue to work on. And climate change is going to be, it's already, but it's going to be a really, really big one. And maybe there's some fantasy there, but my assumption is that we didn't get rid of climate change. I don't think that's possible, but we can figure out ways to adapt to it. And it may mean some migration, some population migration. It may mean some new technologies, even though I don't want to depend on technologies to solve all of this, because a lot of technology is part of how we got into this. But the whole protopian world gives a lot of flexibility around being able to say, we're making progress in these areas. Maybe we haven't made as much progress in these other areas, or we've run up against a wall in some areas, and we're really having to figure out new ways of adapting to that. So I think it's a great setting and a great framework on how do we move forward step by step to keep making things, as many things as possible, better.
Yeah, it's like Star Trek, right? They still have problems in there, and they also have the dilemma of they feel like they need to have a villain in every movie, when Star Trek doesn't really need to have a villain, like an evil person or alien doing evil things, because they couldn't be just facing up the force of nature, or
Yeah.
some sort of late consequence of some ecological problem or something.
One of the major problems with any individual villain, particularly far in the future, where you have like biotechnology that can create super viruses that wipe out 99% of the population, or nuclear bombs made in a garage, or whatever, anything like that becomes a mutually assured destruction concept if you have any villains at all. So it becomes really important for us to try to eliminate the need for villains, I guess, in some ways, before we get to that level of technology. And it's kind of an interesting challenge that I think, protopianism is there to solve in some way.
Right. And we have obviously huge challenges right now where that can be the villain. But also, let's say climate change is the challenge. There are so many different ways that people think we can solve it, or adapt to it, or ignore it if you don't think it's actually a problem. So the way people approach things creates the context for conflict right there. And just disagreeing with it, where some people say, hey, the way to solve traffic is to put technology to make self-driving cars. And other people say, no, the way to solve traffic is to get people out of the car and create, a web of self-reliant small neighborhoods and things like that. So the strategies can be radically different, and that's where a lot of the conflict and the people, whoever the people are that are promoting those things, are would be where the conflict would come in between individual characters. So there's a lot to work with there.
That
Yeah,
makes
because
sense.
antagonist doesn't necessarily equal villain. Antagonist could
Correct.
be
Right.
somebody who, in a different light, is a protagonist.
Exactly. Yeah, and I'm not trying to make anyone a villain. If anything, and I let your podcast talks about saving the world together.
Yeah.
It is that together concept where we have to figure out ways to work together. In Star Trek, as you mentioned, a lot of the challenges are different cultures clashing with each other. Some of them are really subtle, and some of them are very, very diverse. Where I remember one where there was a creature that they kind of looked like an octopus, and they lived in an aqueous environment, underwater. So how do you work with a culture or a species that's that different from yourself? And that becomes the challenge and the conflict. Communication, and some entities need it really cold, some need it really hot. So, for some, climate change might be the birth of a new species that would allow them to proliferate and take over where other species die out because they can't adapt to it. And we're already seeing that. I mean, the whole mass extinction concept. We had 4 or 5 mass extinctions before, and obviously something persists and then slowly but surely becomes the dominant set of species. So a lot of it has to do with time frame, and I wanted to do something that was in relatively near future, so that people can kind of grasp it, and it would be something that our children or certainly our grandchildren would be able to live in. And it kind of keeps it close enough to us that it feels relevant, as opposed to some of the other stuff that's hundreds or thousands of years in the future, where you can kind of make up anything at that point.
Just, I would like to ask one question. I know specifically in the light of, I'm not sure if you're aware about the congressional or House of Representatives UFO hearings lately. So you've
Yes.
already talked about Star Trek a little bit. So my question would be like, what do you think is the place of the whole space thing as part of the future equation?
So my feeling or my belief is, there's no way that we're the only sentient beings in existence. There's definitely other entities out there. How similar they are to us or how different, no idea. Have they visited us? Why would they visit us? A lot of those things are, I think, really good questions, and I do address that in Catapult, because there is. I don't want to give anything away, but
I know it's a little bit something about it.
yeah, there is some help, that both help and an invitation that comes from off world.
Yeah.
But I think I've done it in a way that it's certainly nothing like a lot of the other science fiction, but it does stretch the imagination a little bit, and the way it is incorporated into the story is I think pretty realistic. So I'll be curious to just see how people feel about that.
Yeah, I've always liked to think that if there is aliens out there watching us, that they have this prime directive that we have to prove that we're worthy of them interacting with us for them to kind of come out and interact with us. So this is kind of one of the key concepts.
And and that is pretty much exactly what ends up happening, is that there is at some point there is an invitation.
Yeah.
So
I also imagine that, like in Star Trek, like Captain Picard, they're watching us in a permanent state of facepalm.
Oi!
Fun.
It's kind of like, are they gonna make it? And they're not really allowed to do anything until we get to a certain point of sanity. But I think that the UFO hearings that are happening right now are it's very telling, because it makes me think that some people in higher up places feel that we're ready enough to consider the idea that there is something non-human out there. For so long, it's always been presented as, if anything's out there, they're out to get us. They're out to kill us and destroy us. And now we're starting to see that we're starting to talk about the fact that there's other perspectives. They may be there to support us. They may be there to welcome us once we mature enough. So I'm really excited to see that some of these retired military folks are willing to take a chance, and I think it's still a chance on their part, to hint that there is definitely something out there that we know more about than we're talking about.
Yeah, it's that us versus them mentality that I definitely think we have to kind of evolve past in order for any of this protopian stuff to kind of become mainstream.
Yeah.
And again, yeah, that's really what we're all about, is coming together, trying to avoid this, partisanship, the far right, far left, or the two opposing sides to every story. We're trying to find ways to bring them together, trying to find ideas and concepts that can resonate and inspire both sides to kind of work together. So
Yeah.
It's actually interesting that the UFO hearings are showing that that is a bipartisan issue.
Yes.
Say that again.
The hearings are showing that the alien issue is a bipartisan issue. Both sides are actually political sides are cooperating.
Yeah,
on
both
this.
sides want more information.
And also, they're being able to mention that a large number of the general public is supportive of at least investigating this and don't necessarily feel like it's a threat to us.
Yeah.
So I think that part is kind of is coming in. Now, I'm really I've been involved in political campaigns for my whole adult life. And I have to say that the partisanship at this point, it's never been this radical. It's never been this divisive. And it's disheartening that there's so much unwillingness to even interact with people who hold different perspectives. I mean, having a conversation is in many instances not even an option. If you don't agree with them, then you are instantly the enemy. And I'm hoping that that's simply just the pendulum swinging pretty far in one direction. But as I think I've mentioned to you, Luke, I'm going to be headed off to Costa Rica in a week, actually, to work on a very large-scale permaculture eco-village. So it's like the co-housing neighborhood that I have lived in for the last 25 years, but like times 10. It's much, much larger, includes a farm, a permaculture farm, and there'll be a small number of businesses there. They're going to be not allowing, fossil fuel vehicles after a certain period. I don't know exactly how long. So it takes a lot of the things that we're talking about and really plants them on the ground. And a lot of my role, myself and my wife, role is going to be helping to bring in the future residents for that and talk with them about the concept of sustainable community and permaculture, and really so they understand that if they want to become a member of this is what it would mean. These are the kind of agreements that you're making in order to allow the community to get to that point. So that's going to be a lot of our work over the next year to begin. The first step is going to be the next year.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So as far as future goals then, so you're working on all these books. Are you bringing many other people on board to kind of do similar projects or other similar books? What kinds of connections or what kinds of partnerships are you hoping to make with the whole Protopian novel future?
Well, so as both of you know, writing is somewhat of a isolating task because you pretty much are just there with your. I do a lot of research around it just to make sure that what I'm doing has as much reality as possible, both in locations as well as the technologies. So it is something that I'm doing mostly on my own. But my hope is like I say, going down to Costa Rica to work, have my feet and hands in the dirt there, and helping that become a reality. I will be writing the rest of the books in the series. Book number 2 is already basically complete. It's got to go through some final edits. Book 3 is just in the outline form. So it's going to be, it'll probably take me a couple of years to get through. Well, we'll see, getting through all of that. But for the most part, writing is going to be a part of it. And then the other is these kind of things, being able to share my thinking engage other people in how we can move in this direction, hook up with other people who are doing elements of this. I mean, the advantage of being involved with an eco village is that it does incorporate in many of these aspects. Where living where I live right now in Boulder, Colorado, we have a very energy efficient home. We have a plug-in automobile. We compost and recycle everything. So we certainly have pieces of the puzzle, but it's still fairly isolated in terms of the impact we have on the wider community. Where my hope is that by creating, in some ways, a demonstration of eco village and have people be able to come and visit and take workshops and learn about it, it'll continue to spread the word more quickly.
Well, that's great. I've always been a big fan of the concept of just spreading it one person at a time. If we can just kind of double our influence every year, and have them go and tell somebody else, then it only takes you about 30 years to reach the entire world. So it's not impossible. You just got to focus on
probably less to reach Kevin Bacon.
But my hope is that someone will read this book, Catapult, and go back to my original idea and say, hey, this should be a movie, because it's very visual, so it could be fairly easily translated back into a screenplay and then put up onto the screen as either as a full-length feature film or a mini series, which is much more popular these days. So because that way you're reaching a lot of people all at one time, and then the discussions really, I don't want people to adopt it. I want people to wrestle with it and to say, oh, I like this aspect to it, or I don't like that, or I would want it to be different, or you're just crazy, whatever. Just the dialogue is really important to help people really consciously be actively thinking, and figure out what is their part to play in helping to move things forward.
One question I had for you is whether or not you incorporated much precision fermentation agriculture into any of your ideas, because that's something that I've been kind of really excited about this year, that it's really been starting to take off a little bit, like solar foods, growing foods in kind of a vat, using DNA and gene editing to just kind of precisionally make whatever kind of food you want in a vat and not have to use any kind of land, 99% less land and water, and you could essentially feed a whole city right at the city, and you wouldn't have to kind of rely on climate or agriculture of any kind to kind of feed and house yourself. Are you familiar with much of that?
Not really, because that kind of it both isolates it from the rest of the world, the natural world. It's also pretty high tech, which requires resources on its own. It requires its own energy to do that, and various different compounds. You take a scoop of dirt and you've got a lot of that. Otherwise, you have to synthesize it in the lab, and precision. So that kind of thing, I think, is heading us in a direction that's truly not sustainable. Where I would much prefer that we rip up the streets and plant food right outside rip up our lawns, plant food there, use our roofs for things, and really reintegrate it. Because then that has effects on energy use for getting there. It changes the local microclimate because of, you're using the solar energy to grow food. What's it called? Agrovoltaics, I think, is a really interesting concept that I do support, where they're taking the solar fields, the large scale solar fields, and raising them up a little bit and then growing crops under that. Actually, in my story, I have an instance where sheep are grazing underneath solar panels, and that was before I even learned about agrovoltaics. So what I mentioned is weaving different concepts together in ways that maybe haven't even been thought about, or just tried a tiny bit. So the whole idea of going really high tech and to solve some of these problems, I do not think is going to be sustainable. It's interesting, and it's amazing what scientists and chemists and biologists can come up with, but I truly don't think that that's sustainable. And also, you still have resources here, like I say, rip up the streets, where you got land, you got lots and lots of land right in front of you that could be used for really useful things, and put people to work.
Maybe a different question then. So what do you think there is any particularly promising use of aquaculture or hydroponics?
I
in the
do.
future?
I do. Well, like I said, my senior thesis was aquaculture for wastewater treatment,
Hmm.
so I'm very familiar with it. It uses a tremendous, like 90% less of the water. In that, hydroponics is probably what I'm most interested in, where you're growing both plants and fish, and that's in a symbiotic relationship. I definitely highlight that. In my second book, the protagonist gets hired by the city, actually by the state, to promote a series of sustainable businesses because they have a radical need to reduce their water use,
Hmm.
which is true. I mean, so she goes through, and one of the first ones she visits is an urban aquaponics system where they are growing greens and microgreens and all sorts of leafy vegetables and a few other things, and growing fish, and then they sell the fish out of the store, on the street side of the facility. So, and I don't see that as a big factory farm. I see that as one of those in every neighborhood. So again, you've got more employment, you've got low distances between uses and things like that. So I'm a
And
big.
local self-sustainability.
Yep. Yep.
I guess, and there's definitely something to be said about the therapeutic value of just working with the land, working with nature in general. Even if a robot could do everything, there's therapeutic value for a human to do it, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, my main degree was in biology, marine biology to begin with, and then environmental biology. So I really do believe that being connected to the land, for a variety of reasons, is good for us. And think of humans. I mean, we've been an agricultural species, forever. It's only been the last couple of hundred years, and in some places it's not even changed yet. But it's only been the last 100 years where some people have been able to move, out of the agricultural environment and to just do a job and then walk to the store and buy their food, where some people even think it gets grown.
Yeah.
So it's
Just
definitely yeah.
So just given your background, what did you think about the Avatar movies? You seem to be expertly qualified to give an opinion.
Well, I love them on several ways. I think that the technology of creating that that film is very impressive, and obviously these are a species that are very, very, you know.
In tune with nature.
Yeah, they're connected to nature and the whole underwater part. Now, I laughed out loud when in the first movie, when the U.S. mining company says that, what they're mining is this material called unobtainium. I thought that was so funny and so clever, because that's the whole idea, is that, what you're trying to do is not possible. It's
Interesting.
just not, and it's so destructive and so. I mean, they don't go into too much. I mean, those giant, uh, Earth movers, they must have been nuclear powered. I mean, where would they get, unless that unobtainium is what powered them?
Hmm.
And then it's just the same as nuclear, where we are mining this material and going through incredible amounts of processing to come up with something that creates non-carbon energy at that step. But then what do you do with the waste? And we still haven't figured that out. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of high tech. I'm very much. I was involved with what was called appropriate technology back in the 70s and 80s, which is kind of more human scale things, working within the cycles of nature. So that's much more my perspective, for sure.
Along the same lines, what do you think of virtual reality to try to get more in tune with nature if you're in cities? Or is that kind of going to be a part of the solution to connect people with nature if they're not close to it? Have
I mean,
AR and
it's
VR?
for some. I don't think that's how they're using it. I don't know if either of you are familiar with a platform called Second Life.
Yes.
So that came out, I don't know, 15 years ago, and I got involved very early on. And I went in there and I purchased an island and had someone build an eco village there, called Etopia. It's still there. I sold it to one of my residents, and it's still there. And if you walk around in the world, you can see there's a train and there's a gondola. There's no cars. There's integrated work-live environments, educational, agriculture. So it was kind of my calling card for a long time when I say, hey, if you want to see what I'm talking about, go visit Etopia. So it had, and schools would come, groups of kids would come, and they would walk around, and there'd be tours. I gave countless numbers of talks there. So it can be used as a tool, but that's for the most part not how it's being used.
Yeah. That's interesting. Well, it's definitely with Apple kind of getting into the mix with their big $3,000 AR thing next year. It'll be interesting to see, whether it ever really takes off and hits mainstream and gets to a point where we can actually use it to kind of live our lives, work, and experience nature if we're not close to it, right? Without having to spend thousands of dollars to travel to a nature paradise, we can just kind of put on a pair of goggles and experience it. So it definitely will be interesting to see how that evolves.
Yeah. Well,
Although, isn't the point that it would be better to be close to it?
It
yeah.
would be,
And
yes.
to not be sitting there by yourself with goggles on and not really dealing with any other human being directly. I mean, that seems like you're going the wrong direction. In Catapult, I have a scene in the 2025 version where the protagonist Danielle is taken to a park, and it's a very unique kind of park, which I won't say much about, but it shows kind of the extent of what happens how the haves and have-nots have very different access to wilderness, and how they deal with it. Steve, who's her partner there, and Danielle have very different responses to seeing this park that's created. It's a membership-only park. So I don't know if you remember Soylent Green, but there was a scene in that where there was this little building in the middle of town, and inside the building was the last living tree, and it was so sad. But it was the idea where they did want to protect it, but they had to kind of isolate it from everything else because the rest of the environment was so poisonous and so deadly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we definitely want to try our best to keep green everywhere, keep our cities as green and natural as possible as we move forward.
Yeah. And think about integration as opposed to division and separation. And that is also very much the challenge is with personalities and people. How do we learn or relearn to work together? And maybe in a way we never have before, because we've come out of this tribal world for hundreds of thousands of years where the people over the hill, for the most part, were potentially a threat. So you had to protect yourselves or protect your resources or your animals or your wives. So, we have some evolutionary work to do to learn to work together. And I think that's probably one of the places we need to put a fair amount of attention into, is learning how do we collaborate again. And the co-housing work that I've done touches on that, because I teach consensus decision making and meeting facilitation and conflict resolution. And all of those are skills that are teachable, but we have very little experience really working with them. So for a lot of people, even though the concept of community is something they really like, they may not have any real personal experience living it, and need to go through some time and training to really understand how to do that.
Yeah, it's the psychological challenges of moving forward into the future are more important and more challenging than the technological challenges of trying to save the world in some ways, right?
Or equally, for sure, but they're both critical.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, we're so happy to have had you here and hear from you today, Zev. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing. I'm really excited to continue to kind of keep updated and to read all your future works and to see where things go. Love to continue to learn from you as we build our plan for saving the world in some small way here with this podcast and with all the work we do.
Yeah, thank you so much for actually taking the effort to put this out there. And I do want to encourage people to go to Amazon, and the softbound copy is available. The ebook will probably be available within the next month. And that'll be for those who don't want a softback copy and can read on their Kindle. That'll be available as well. So keep your eye out for that.
If they search for just Catapult, will it come right up? Catapult or Catapult Protopian Futures or?
if people go to my well, there's a couple ways. You can go straight to Amazon and put in my name, and that should bring up all the books that I have on there, including Catapult being the first one, the most recent one. Um, and then I'll continue. It'll be on my website on protopiafutures.com. It's listed on there under books.
Excellent. Martin, any final questions or comments from your side that you'd like to throw out there?
Just I feel I should read the book.
I encourage it, and leave a review. That's one of the ways that readers can be most helpful to emerging authors like us, is to get positive review, realistic reviews, so that others will be encouraged to purchase the book themselves.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you so much again. You've definitely inspired me in many ways. So thank you for that, and
Thank you.
thanks for joining us today. And hopefully we'll have you again for your next book in the future, or for any other time when you feel like you want to collaborate with us or come on and share some more of your work with the building the eco village. Where is it? Costa Rica, you said?
In Costa Rica, on the near Nosara, which is on the Pacific side, and definitely, I think we'll probably be sending out a short email, maybe monthly, to just let people know kind of what we're up to, and send photos, and just continue to inspire people to move forward in their own world.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. Learn more at Protopian Futures and savingtheworldtogether.org anytime, and reach out to us if you have ideas on how to save the world together. Thanks so much, and let's keep on saving the world. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.